Judge Harold Mullins, Clara Vasquez, Victor Dalen. 3 names, 3 lives, and a deadly web of secrets that would destroy everything they touched. One was a respected judge, whose private life became the target of a ruthless sextortion ring. Another was a young woman caught in the middle, playing a dangerous game she barely understood. And the last, a shadowy mastermind, orchestrating blackmail and murder from behind encrypted screens. In this story, power, betrayal, and obsession collide, and no one is safe. Judge Harold Mullins was the kind of man who seemed untouchable. In the courthouse, his presence was commanding, his voice firm, and his decisions carried weight. Over the years he built a reputation for being a judge who didn't bend to pressure, whether it came from politicians, criminals, or even the media. He had been on the bench for nearly 30 years, and during that time, his rulings had shaped the legal landscape of his city. Behind this carefully maintained image, however, Mullins carried secrets. He lived alone in a large brick home on the edge of town, his wife having passed away nearly a decade earlier. The judge threw himself into his work, often staying late at the courthouse, poring over case files until exhaustion forced him home. But when the robes were off and the courtroom emptied, Mullins had vulnerabilities he guarded fiercely. Though his public life appeared disciplined and controlled, his private life was more complicated. Those who knew him well sensed there were pieces of his story that never quite fit together, though no one dared ask questions. By the time he reached his early 60s, Mullins had grown accustomed to his dual existence. To the world, he was the stern figure of justice. But in private, he sought companionship in ways that could compromise him. He was cautious, always calculating risks, but even the most careful man can make mistakes. And for someone in his position, one mistake was enough to undo everything. The city, where Mullins served, had seen its share of scandals involving public officials, yet his name never appeared in the papers for the wrong reasons. Reporters often tried to dig into his past, looking for cracks, but they came up empty-handed. It was this clean record that made the eventual revelations so shocking. No one could imagine Judge Mullins so polished, so disciplined, becoming the center of a scandal that would shatter not only his career but also his life. Friends and colleagues noticed changes in him during the months leading up to the tragedy. He seemed more distracted, his sharpness dulled by something weighing heavily on his mind. Some assumed it was age or fatigue, but others whispered that the judge was hiding a personal struggle. His habit of lingering outside the courthouse late at night grew more frequent, as if he was delaying going home. He had become a man carrying invisible burdens, though he maintained his stern courtroom composure. In those quiet moments, away from the bench, Mullins was not the untouchable figure the public admired. He was a man with secrets, and secrets have a way of attracting danger. What no one yet realized was that those hidden aspects of his life would soon become the very weapon used against him. The stage was set for a fall no one could have predicted, a fall that would drag his name into a scandal darker than anyone imagined. The first sign that something was wrong came quietly, without warning, when a reporter at a small local news outlet received an anonymous email. At first glance it seemed like a prank, the kind of spam that cluttered inboxes daily. But attached to the message were photographs that made the reporter's hands shake. They showed Judge Harold Mullins in intimate moments with a woman who was clearly much younger than him. Along with the images came a chilling demand. If Mullins did not pay a substantial amount of money, the pictures would be released to the public. The email ended with a threat that his distinguished career and reputation would burn in the spotlight. The reporter hesitated. A story like this, if true, could destroy one of the most respected judges in the state. But there was something unusual about the email. It was written in a calculated, professional tone, far from the chaotic ramblings of a prankster. The photographs were grainy but unmistakably real. Within hours, similar emails landed in the inboxes of other local media outlets, and even more alarmingly, in the chambers of Mullins himself. What began as whispers about the judge's private life suddenly transformed into a dangerous extortion attempt. What shocked investigators later was that Mullins was not the only target. The same group had approached several high-profile men in positions of power. Politicians, executives, and community leaders had all been ensnared in the same net. Some paid quietly, hoping to protect their families and careers. Others ignored the threats and prayed the blackmailers would move on. But Mullins was different. His reputation had been built on refusing to give in to bullies. To him, the extortion was not just a personal threat, but an attack on the system of justice itself. His decision to stand firm would set him apart and place him in far greater danger than he realized. As the emails spread and rumors began swirling in the city, the image of Judge Mullins started to shift. A man once admired as a pillar of discipline now faced whispers in courthouse hallways and quiet speculation at dinner tables. People wondered if the judge's private life was about to topple the public figure they had trusted for decades. But beneath the surface, something more sinister was happening. The sextortion scheme was not just about money, it was about power, control, and silencing those who resisted. And Mullins, by refusing to yield, had unknowingly marked himself as the one target the blackmailers could not afford to leave standing. The investigation began quietly, almost cautiously, with a handful of federal agents reviewing the threatening emails Judge Mullins had received. On the surface, they looked like any other digital blackmail attempt. But deeper analysis revealed layers of sophistication. The messages were routed through multiple servers, each one masking the origin, each bounce erasing traces of the sender. The wording, while simple, was chillingly precise, written to provoke fear while leaving almost no forensic trail. It became clear early on that this was not the work of a lone opportunist. This was organized, deliberate, and professional. As agents dug further, they began connecting Mullins' case to others. A city councilman had quietly stepped down after unexplained health issues. A prominent business executive had liquidated assets and disappeared overseas. Behind closed doors, whispers suggested both men had been blackmailed. It was no coincidence. They too had received anonymous threats demanding money in exchange for silence. Each victim was carefully selected, not at random, but for influence, wealth, or the potential to cause scandal if exposed. The pattern was unmistakable. Someone had built a system that preyed on vulnerability and reputation. What distinguished Mullins was his refusal to comply. While others chose to protect themselves by paying or retreating from public life, he reported the threats directly to the FBI. His decision was principled, but it carried enormous risk. By resisting, he became not just another victim, but a threat to the network itself. The criminals behind the scheme relied on secrecy and silence. If one target broke ranks and exposed them, the entire operation could unravel. Mullins had set himself on a collision course with people who thrived on intimidation. Meanwhile, investigators began mapping out the mechanics of the sextortion network. At its core were individuals who created fake identities online, posing as attractive young women. These personas were used to lure high-profile men into conversations that quickly escalated into compromising exchanges. Sometimes the encounters were purely digital, with carefully staged photos and video calls designed to entrap. Other times, paid accomplices, real women desperate for money, were sent to meet the targets in person, ensuring undeniable evidence could be captured. Once material was gathered, the extortion began, always with escalating demand. Mullins' case exposed just how far the group was willing to go. It wasn't just about draining bank accounts. It was about control. For the criminals, money was only part of the prize. The true power came from silencing individuals who might otherwise expose corruption or resist outside influence. By trapping judges, politicians, and business leaders, they built leverage over the very people meant to enforce law and order. In essence, it was a parallel system of power, operating in the shadows, feeding on fear and shame. For Mullins, the choice to fight back meant that his every move was now watched. Surveillance teams noted strange vehicles near his home, unmarked packages arriving at his office, and even unusual faces in the courtroom gallery during trials. The more he resisted, the more the network closed in. What had begun as digital threats was turning into something far more dangerous. He was no longer just a name on a screen, he had become a liability, one the criminals could not afford to ignore. On the evening of February 12th, the courthouse was quieter than usual. A winter storm had passed earlier in the day, leaving the streets damp and the air heavy with the smell of rain. Judge Harold Mullins was one of the last to leave, carrying a leather briefcase stuffed with files he intended to review at home. His staff had already gone, and without the comfort of a security escort, cut months earlier due to budget concerns, he walked alone through the dimly lit parking garage. Surveillance cameras later captured him pausing briefly beside his car, adjusting his coat against the chill, unaware that someone was watching. When police arrived, the scene was chilling in its precision. Mullins lay beside his car, his briefcase spilled open on the driveway, legal papers scattered and soaked from the damp ground. He had been shot twice in the chest at close range. There were no signs of a struggle. His watch, wallet, and phone remained untouched, ruling out robbery. Whoever had killed him had done so with purpose, leaving behind no obvious clues beyond the body itself. The execution-style nature of the shooting suggested a message rather than a random act of violence. Detectives combed through the immediate area but found little. A neighbor's security camera captured a blurry image of a dark sedan idling down the block minutes before the shots were fired, but the license plate was unreadable. Another witness reported seeing a figure in a hooded jacket moving quickly away from the scene, though the description was too vague to build a profile. There were no fingerprints, no shell casings left behind, and no immediate suspects. Whoever planned the attack had been careful, meticulous, and well prepared. As news of the murder spread, shock rippled through the legal community. Judges rarely became targets of violence in the city, and for someone as respected as Mullins to be gunned down in front of his home was almost unthinkable. By midnight, police had sealed off the street, canvassing for witnesses and collecting fragments of information. Inside the house, nothing appeared disturbed, ruling out the possibility of a burglary gone wrong. The absence of theft, the precision of the shooting, and the timing just as Mullins' private struggles were surfacing, suggested something far deeper than coincidence. In the shadows, someone had decided that Harold Mullins' refusal to submit came at too high a cost. His murder was not the end of a personal scandal, it was the beginning of a much larger and more dangerous conspiracy coming into the light. The early days of the investigation into Judge Mullins' murder were chaotic. Detectives were under immense pressure from both the media and the public, who wanted answers about how such a high-profile figure could be assassinated on his own driveway. At first, suspicion naturally fell on individuals with personal grudges. Mullins had sentenced dozens of violent offenders over the years, and it was not unusual for a judge of his stature to receive threats. But as investigators dug deeper, the evidence pointed away from the obvious suspects and towards something more calculated, something connected to the quiet storm already brewing behind the scenes. The breakthrough came when Mullins' phone was unlocked and examined. On the surface, it appeared ordinary. Emails from colleagues, reminders of hearings, and the endless stream of text messages that come with a busy professional life. But buried beneath the routine communications were strings of threatening messages from an untraceable number. The texts were direct, filled with warnings that if Mullins did not comply, he would face consequences beyond disgrace. The timing of these messages coincided exactly with the release of the compromising photos, suggesting that the murder and the sextortion attempt were intertwined. The digital trail revealed an unnerving truth. Mullins was not alone in resisting the demands. Several victims had heard similar threats, but most chose silence. Some quietly paid large sums to make the harassment stop, while others altered their lives to avoid further exposure. Only Mullins had refused outright, openly reporting the attempts to federal agents. Investigators now believed that his refusal had made him the one man the organization could not afford to let live. His death was not just revenge, but also a warning to others considering defiance. The scale of the operation grew clearer when the FBI began pooling information from cases across state lines. What seemed like isolated scandals formed a larger pattern. Judges, council members, and executives were being systematically targeted. The blackmailers had carefully selected their prey, individuals with both money and reputations to protect. The sextortion scheme had grown into a sprawling enterprise, and Mullins had been the first to stand up against it. Back at the crime scene, the lack of physical evidence now made more sense. The killers were not amateurs. They had experience in covering their tracks. The murder was not meant to solve the problem of Mullins. It was designed to terrify, to send a ripple effect across anyone else thinking of resisting. What had begun as a string of mysterious emails and text messages was now revealed to be part of a deadly web, where silence was bought with fear and defiance was punished with death. For investigators, the question was no longer whether they could catch Mullins' killer. It was whether they could dismantle the entire network before more bodies fell. The images that first surfaced of Judge Mullins with a younger woman had been the heart of the scandal, but until investigators identified her, the case lacked direction. After weeks of tracing online accounts and payment records, the woman was finally unmasked. Clara Vasquez, a 27-year-old law student with no criminal record and little public presence. On paper, she appeared ordinary, struggling financially, juggling part-time jobs, and fighting to keep up with tuition bills. Yet behind that facade was a carefully orchestrated role in a much larger scheme, one that placed her at the center of the judge's downfall. When agents first approached Clara, she played the part of a victim. She claimed she had been manipulated into a relationship with Mullins, insisting that her personal photos had been stolen and weaponized by people she didn't know. Her story was sympathetic, even believable at first glance. She portrayed herself as another casualty of online predators, someone exploited by the same people who targeted the judge. But investigators had already begun uncovering details that poked holes in her narrative. Bank records showed transfers from overseas accounts deposited into her name, payments far too large to be explained by tutoring or part-time work. As the financial trail was pieced together, a disturbing picture formed. Clara had not been an innocent bystander at all. She had been paid to approach Mullins, to gain his trust, and to entangle him in situations that could later be used against him. The relationship had been carefully engineered, from the first encounter to the compromising photographs. Clara was not the mastermind, but she was a willing participant, compensated for her role in luring powerful men into traps. The moment investigators confronted her with the evidence, her facade of innocence cracked. Facing the possibility of years in prison for conspiracy and fraud, Clara's options narrowed. It was then that she agreed to cooperate. Her testimony opened a new chapter in the case, shedding light on how the network operated and how deep its reach extended. She described a system where women were recruited, often under the promise of quick money, to act as bait for wealthy or influential men. Some recruits had no idea their encounters were being filmed or monitored, while others, like Clara, knew exactly what they were part of. Her cooperation revealed details that had remained hidden. Meetings were arranged by intermediaries who communicated through encrypted apps. Payments were funneled through layered accounts to conceal their origins, and most importantly, Clara identified the name of the man who coordinated her involvement, Victor Dalen, a former cybersecurity consultant turned shadowy figure in the world of digital crime. According to her, Dalen had been orchestrating sextortion schemes for years, and Mullins' refusal to cooperate had placed him directly in Dalen's crosshairs. The name Victor Dalen emerged like a shadow pulled into the light, until Clara Vasquez identified him. Investigators had been chasing fragments, anonymous emails, encrypted messages, and faceless threats that seemed to vanish as quickly as they appeared. But now there was a man, a former cybersecurity consultant with a checkered past, whose skills and connections made him capable of building the kind of elaborate extortion network that had ensnared Judge Mullins. Digging into his history revealed a trajectory that began in legitimate tech work, but spiraled into something darker. Years earlier, Dalen had worked for a private firm contracted by the government, specializing in data security and digital forensics. He knew how systems worked, how to exploit weaknesses, and how to cover his own tracks. Somewhere along the way, he traded ethics for opportunity. The most damning discovery was a string of encrypted messages, coordinating final measures against an unnamed target at the same time. Mullins was murdered. The language was deliberately vague, but paired with the timeline and Clara's testimony, it was enough to establish intent. Prosecutors now had a working theory. Dalen had ordered the hit on Mullins to preserve the secrecy of his network, and to send a warning to others under his control. What he underestimated was that the murder had done the opposite. Instead of silencing victims, it had drawn national attention and put law enforcement squarely on his trail. When federal agents finally tracked him to a safe house in Nevada, the operation was swift and heavily armed. Dalen was found surrounded by computers, hard drives, and encrypted phones, tools of his trade. He surrendered without a fight, confident that his digital walls would protect him even in custody. But investigators had already begun dismantling his empire, brick by brick, and his capture marked the first time the elusive mastermind had been forced out from behind his screens. For those who had lived under his shadow, it was the first sign that justice was finally closing in. The arrest of Victor Dalen was only the beginning of a long and complicated fight for justice. When he was brought into custody, prosecutors knew the case would not be simple. Dalen had carefully insulated himself, never leaving behind obvious fingerprints or direct communications that tied him to the murder of Judge Mullins. His defense attorneys leaned heavily on that fact, painting him as a scapegoat, a man accused simply because of his past work in cybersecurity and the testimony of a compromised witness. But the government had been patient, gathering a mountain of digital evidence, financial trails, and cooperating testimonies from people who had once worked under Dalen's command. Piece by piece, the portrait of his empire came into focus, and the jury began to see the man not as a victim of coincidence, but as the architect of a vast criminal enterprise. The trial drew national attention, with reporters filling every available seat in the courtroom. Families of victims who had been blackmailed or silenced came forward, some breaking years of secrecy to tell their stories. They described how the threats had ruined marriages, destroyed careers, and pushed people into lives of isolation. Some confessed that they had paid enormous sums just to keep their reputations intact. Others admitted they had contemplated suicide under the weight of shame. Their testimony revealed that Mullins had not been alone, but rather one of many, whose lives had been targeted. The difference was that he refused to yield, and for that he paid the ultimate price. What shocked the public most during the proceedings was the scale of Dalen's operation. Dozens of fake identities had been created, each tailored to lure specific victims. Money flowed through shell companies in multiple countries, making it almost impossible to trace. Dalen's associates, some of them women like Clara Vasquez, were scattered across the country, living double lives while feeding information back to him. It was not the work of an impulsive criminal, but a structured organization designed to exploit power and fear. When confronted with the evidence, Dalen never admitted guilt. Instead, he sat silently, watching as his empire unraveled piece by piece. For the family and colleagues of Judge Mullins, the trial was both a reckoning and a painful reminder of loss. His colleagues remembered him as a man who valued integrity above all else, someone who stood for the law even when it made him vulnerable. The verdict, when it came, was decisive. Dalen was convicted on charges of conspiracy, extortion, racketeering, and the murder of Judge Harold Mullins. The sentence was life without parole, ensuring he would never again operate from the shadows. In the aftermath, the scandal left a permanent mark on the city. Reforms were introduced to strengthen protections for public officials, and to invest in cybersecurity against organized digital crime. Clara Vasquez entered witness protection, her name forever tied to the case, though her testimony had played a critical role in dismantling the network. For the victims who came forward, the trial offered a measure of closure, though scars remained. Judge Mullins' legacy became complicated but enduring. To some, he was a man caught in a private failing that left him vulnerable. To others, he was a symbol of courage, a man who chose to resist when others gave in. In the end, his death illuminated a system of corruption that would have remained hidden for years. The Sextortion scandal had claimed him as its most tragic casualty, but his defiance ensured that the empire behind it would be exposed and destroyed. Justice, though delayed, had been served. not only for Mullins but for every victim silenced by fear until the truth finally came to light.